Well, welcome everyone. I'm Pam Watts. I'm the Executive Director for NIRSA. I'll be facilitating the roundtable today. Today we're going to focus on considerations around planning for reopening your facilities and your programs. I'm joined today by three of your great colleagues, Mike Edwards from Georgia Tech, George Brown from University of Minnesota, and Bill Crockett from University of Maryland. If you've been on these before, this will follow a similar format where we'll kick it off with each of them sharing over the course of a couple minutes what they're thinking about reopening, what their approaches are to reopening, and then we'll open it up for questions. Please use the chat box. We'll be watching that not only for questions that our panelists or others can respond to, but also share your great ideas, what you're thinking about as we're all planning for reopening. If I see a particular good idea or something that looks germane to the conversation, I may call on you to go ahead and share more about that with the full group verbally. Okay, I think we're up to 10 screens. I think, let me just pop over here and see if we've got others coming in. Okay, it looks like it's settled down. This roundtable, was advertised for directors and senior leaders. We're not real strict about that. But I do want to focus the conversation on how directors and senior leaders need to think about reopening. Across all of our roundtables this week, some of them last week, I'm sure into next week, in the various functional areas, facilities and aquatics and intramurals and all the rest of them, there's some really good detailed conversations going on about all those aspects we have to consider as we reopen not only facilities but programs and services. So today we'd really like to keep this opportunity for directors to have a conversation about what they need to think about strategically, how you're engaging with your divisional leadership and your other upper administration leadership, and what are those unique things that you all need to be thinking about, planning for, supporting your staff with as leaders of your department. So I'm going to pass it to Mike Edwards now to share how he's thinking about reopening at Georgia Tech.
Thanks, Pam. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody is safe and healthy out there. I want to talk just a little bit about the strategic positioning that we've done and the approach that we've taken here at Georgia Tech. And it really is a modeling from the division level. Our division is, as we all are, is beginning to move from response to recovery, and what does that look like? And so our division developed several committees to look at three different scenarios. There's a great article out there by McKinsey and company that talks about three potential scenarios, and that's 100% face-to-face instruction, normal operations. 50% face-to-face, 50% online, and of course the one that we really don't want, it's a 100% online and not returning until spring of 2021. So everything is focusing on those three scenarios for us at the division level. And so committees were put together, a student committee, an employee committee, a budget committee, a service operations committee, facilities committee, and communications committee. And what I've done is to model that exactly. Same committees. We have about 7 people on the division committees. And so those people that are on those division committees are also chairing our committees as we begin to move forward. The only additional committee that I've put together is a programming committee to talk about how we deliver our programs and services under the three different scenarios. And in both at the division level and at the department level, we have focused not on individual functional areas, but an umbrella look, a higher strategic look at all of those things that are part of a recovery mode in each one of those scenarios. And we've done that because we really want to capitalize on the strengths and the skills of our individuals. It's the same on the division level. There's a lot of cross-function people on the committees looking at things from a very high level, getting another eye on it, another thought process, another brain on those particular topics under each of the scenarios. And so we've had some meetings as we've begun to move forward, and the first meeting is really a brainstorming, beginning to put down everything. What do we all have in common? What are the commonalities of a recovery for us? Commonalities in social distancing, commonalities in occupancy and participation numbers, and those kinds of things. How will the students look at it? How do we ensure their safety while they're utilizing CRC? How do we keep parents and guardians informed to reduce the fear that will obviously be out there at the time we reopen? Employees, how we're going to safeguard them. Budget, finances, everybody is concerned about that and what that looks like. I, like everybody else, has probably done somewhere between 100 and 150 different projections for budgets in finance. It's just something that we're all going through, and more than just 3 scenarios, but we've kept our focus on 3 scenarios. The service component and the facilities component, and so that's really how we've begun to function towards the recovery from a strategic level, from looking at things and putting things and having people look at it from different angles. And so that's been our approach to this point.
Thanks, Mike. Before I pass it to George, there was one quick question, since we've all seen in the news that Georgia is starting to reopen. How has that influenced your timeline at Georgia Tech?
It really hasn't influenced it. Yes, our governor has begun to reopen various areas. Fortunately, I don't have a hair salon or a tattoo salon in my building. And so I don't have to worry too much about that. But he did say gyms and fitness centers. Right now, the University System of Georgia has told us to just hold in place and do what we're doing, but to begin to build our plans and think things on how we're going to reopen our building. I can only imagine that it will probably come really quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to George, who's going to share about some of his approaches in his department to reopening.
Yeah, first of all, greetings. It's great to see on the screen so many of my esteemed colleagues from around the nation. It's really, really cool. Miss you guys in Phoenix, as I'm sure many of you would have been there. But under these circumstances, a lot of what we're doing right now, I will be really honest, is very much parallel to what Mike was talking about at Georgia Tech. I think we're probably on pretty much the same trajectory at Minnesota. We benefit from having a very large staff. So I would speak to maybe 2 things with regard to your staff, and a little bit about design thinking that might be worth looking at with your organization. You're probably going to have a lot of staff who are, quite frankly, pretty hungry and pretty ready to contribute. We found that in triaging much of what we were trying to do, we had certain staff that were kind of on the sidelines as we went into the immediate sort of DEFCON 1 level of getting closed and getting things booked out. And some of the program areas specifically really felt like they were on the sidelines watching mostly facility-driven things and immediacy of budget impact, looking at safety protocols, powering down, staffing situations and things. So some of the traditional competitive sports folks, to some degree, I think even the fitness folks felt like, God, how do we pivot in this area? And so I think what we have found early on in the reopening discussions is that there is a real high level of energy for these staff to contribute. And so what that has maybe unintentionally and unwittingly contributed to is a little bit of dissonance amount, the left hand and the right hand doing what we do. And we envisioned that if we were asked to open quickly, some of our areas would be ahead of the others because they were further along in their thinking process. So I would kind of go back to what Mike was saying about coordinating the structure of your staff. We are very much in line with him on we are using our associate director for strategic planning to really guide that. but he's working hand in hand with our associate director who oversees aquatics, because she is our chief risk management officer. And so as staff from the different areas start to contribute their own reopening from their own lens, it's really important that that cascades up through this vetting process. And we're using two primary assumptions when we go through how to open. One is the assumption that risk management is penultimate. There's not going to be anything that we do that is sketchy to risk management, that we're pushing the envelope on. We're going to be ultra conservative, and particularly in light of public health need. That we're gonna default to decisions that will probably be less than more, simply because of the assumption of risk management. The second, and I think this kind of jumps into what we're doing maybe a little bit novel with respect to design thinking and innovation, is the idea that everything is going to come from the customer's point of view. I think it's very, very easy for us, and particularly as directors on this call, to be a little bit myopic to the idea that we have a certain content expertise that we know we have, and that we're going to look at things perhaps from a slightly elevated perspective. I think it's really important to go back to the idea of, from the time that the consumer, whether it's a student, a faculty, a staff, an alumni, whoever your membership categories are, that we really almost have a GoPro camera on them and superimpose ourselves to the best of our ability, from everything from touch points to entry to social distancing within equipment to loads and abilities to have classes, fitness offerings, what kind of virtual versus in-person intramural programming, competitive sports programming, what does this mean for club sports? I know in those details we're thinking that through, but I would challenge you guys to really think of that from the standpoint of the consumer. Also, I think the backdrop that Mike made so clear, and I think this is really worth going back to and really accentuating, we're going to have a lot of people who are in different degrees of safety and ability or desire to come back. They're going to want to come back because they know the value of what we do, but they're going to be very reticent about that opportunity given the nature of the pandemic, the nature of how long they've been sheltering in place from their home. Superimpose that with an 18-year-old coming away for the first time for their experience and the obvious, apprehension that they may encounter. Couple that with an older faculty member who is very concerned because she presents in a vulnerable category or vulnerable population. So I think we need to be thinking about that. The last thing I would say from the Minnesota perspective that we're trying to do is this innovative design, is that we're really willing to tool things up with the backdrop that perfection is the enemy of good, and that we're not going to try to be perfect. We're going to try to do things that are functionally best risk management best practices, but it may get to be in a design thinking mode. We may get to 70% of the prototype in terms of a new operation. We won't get to 100%. And we're going to field test a lot of things. How far is the equipment spaced out? What level of lap swimming integration with how many to a lane? Because I think U.S. swimming is pretty conspicuously absent a lot of direction right now. They're really waiting on that. So we may be thought leaders in that regard. My last comment to my colleagues here, and you know this already, is that while you're the content expert, be prepared for what I call significant impact from executive leadership. It's amazing how many people become resident public health leaders that are coming from your president, provost, other leadership thing. Right meaning, no doubt about it, but they are going to interject what they believe is best for collegiate recreation offering. And I don't have any great epiphany for how to handle that except to expect it and be able to pivot quickly on that, because we sure as heck are here at Minnesota every day on that regard. So that's kind of where we are right now with some of the novelty of what we're trying to do.
Great, thanks, George. And it's great to see all the information being shared in the chat as well. I'm going to turn it over to Bill Crockett. He actually has a couple slides to screen share. So for our visual learners, here's a couple visuals that'll outline what Bill is doing.
Thank you and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's great seeing so many friends and colleagues. It's great again for everyone to be on. I just want to iterate what both George and Mike said. A lot of the stuff that we've been doing here at University of Maryland, Baltimore has been very strategic looking, but we have drilled down for some takeaways and I hope to share some of that. I also want to say, hey, George, come to my challenge when the president of the university is a medical doctor and your provost and everyone else has backgrounds in the health sciences. So, and the governor's task force is led by your chief infectious disease specialist. So my senior leadership pushes down in a different way and makes it interesting. As for Maryland, we also have an interesting thing. We don't expect to be back before June 1, and even that, we don't even have a date yet. No date has been set, just we're reading based on how all the protocols and steps are. But if we do come back, our governor has issued a 3-step readiness and recovery plan where recreational facilities are in step 2. So we probably will land back in step 1 where we can't even open up a recreational center yet. He is allowing outdoor facilities to be open in step 1, but indoor facilities can't open until step 2. But I'm going to share some slides that we've done here at the university, which actually hits on a lot of the points that both Mike and George just shared. But I am also a visual learner, so let me pull this up quickly. So hopefully everyone can see that, but we're calling it the UMB Road to Recovery and Readiness. And we formed a work group, and our work group isn't just recreation, it's 3 areas of student affairs, and it's going to expand out farther. But right now it's recreation, union, and event services. And because there's a lot of sameness, but there's also a lot of uniqueness that can provide different types of learning. So, and it was easy to form this group because this group really is the core of what was our response group before we went into our closure and shutdown. So we went from response to recovery and readiness. We've been meeting bi-weekly, and we're going to ramp up those meetings to weekly. And what we've talked about is a Plan 30 framework, and I'll explain that in a second. Wellness checks on the building. So once to conserve because of the deficits that we're going to experience due to the student fee refunds, the loss of auxiliary revenues, and some other impacts. We've been trying to reduce our expenses in this fiscal year and going into the next fiscal year, which has been almost a complete shutdown of the facility in all aspects, including the draining of our aquatics center. So, but we are still doing wellness checks on the building with both our environmental health and safety, our facilities management. We're turning our systems back on for a few hours every other day just to keep fresh air and other well checks going through. And our pumps and circulation things are being checked on a regular basis from our central facilities management. But we're also talking about facility recovery and readiness. And just like George and Mike talked about, we've asked everyone to look at 3 lenses: the user, the administration, and risk management, and knowing that none of them can leave, but they have to come together and we got to find that sweet spot. And then we've also talked about, is it a design thinking model? Is it a project management model? Or for those that have opened new facilities, what was it like when you opened that facility for the first time? What were the steps that you got to get that new facility ready? Because there's a lot of the same learning that we had from that I remember from 10 years ago that I'm just recirculating now, and it's just coming back up, and I'm starting to move some of those same principles again. So part of it is that we started looking at some of the constructs and factors to get to an achievable state. As George said, it won't be a perfect state, right? We got to put perfection aside. And we got to understand what's achievable for us, right? Whether that's 70%, 60%, 80%, we don't know that yet, but we're going to define what is achievable. We have to identify our hotspots. What are going to be the concerns in the facility, in the programs, in the operations? Wellness screenings, will we be doing them, if and when? What's personal distancing solutions look like? What's our future hours of operation? What's our staffing level? Will there be caps or limits to participation? Services and programs, when do they come back? What do they come back as? Protective equipment for staff and users. And I don't want to forget about maintaining the win. We learned a lot of good stuff with this stay from home. We learned that we can work remotely. So is there a shift of keeping some of that in play? Can our virtual offerings stay in and enhance the services in this new achievable state? One thing that you got to consider, do you have shared office space? Do you have open office designs or shared office space? You may want to keep some form of remote working going on so you can maintain personal distance within your own office configurations. So those are things to think about. What were those wins, and keeping those lessons moving. So this is what I call the Plan 30. what does it look for us to be 30 days out? What do we need to have ready? What do we need to prepare? What does it look like 30 days before we land back on campus? Then once we land on campus, what do the next 30 days, the first 30 days look like? What should we be doing? What should we be putting into place? Then the next 30 days, and so on until we get to that achievable solution, right? And the reason why I use 30 days, could it be 2 weeks? Everyone's gonna have to model their own. Could it be longer than that? Could it be shorter? I just felt 30 days was something that people could put their mind around, and they're discrete, they're just chunks that you can really create strategic, but both tactical operational plans. And if you need to pivot, you can pivot pretty quickly. But when we get to that achievable state, we have to understand what's gonna look the same. And this is to the user. What's gonna look the same to the user? What's gonna look different to the user? What's gonna look brand new to the user, even if it isn't new, right? And what's gonna be absent? Because we know that everything's not gonna return. And how do we manage that? How do we communicate that? And how do we navigate through this from the experience of both our staff that are working and the users that are coming for our services and programs? And then this is how I looked at the model, and it sounds pretty much what Mike and George had, but we look at, I call it, look inside the box first. We got our facilities, our services, and programs, right? And we know that where does the staff play a role in both the facilities, the services, and programs, both in that response, the recovery, and the readiness? And where does leadership, both internal to the department, but the university leadership, play within the impact to the facilities, the services, and programs? And outside the box, which are still areas that you need to incorporate, control, leverage, is your communication plan. So we're utilizing our student affairs communication team to be part of the response and recovery readiness, recovery and readiness, and developing the right messaging so that when people land back into our services and programs, they understand the changes, and it's more that we can also get that buy-in. And that communication plan will be both an internal look and an external look. Talking to those that are going to be doing the services and talking to those that are going to be using the services, and coming up with the right messaging and the right appropriate ways to roll this out. What's our business plan? We know that there's a fiscal implication and fiscal impacts. So how are we going to start navigating and making sure that the resources we need for readiness can be achieved? What's our access management? And I don't mean just for the recreational facilities, but just in general, people accessing your campus, your spaces. What does that look like? And how does that impact across those? And finally, what are those partnerships and collaborations that you need to leverage? Your environmental health and services, your facilities management, your university communication, all those different areas. Where are those partnerships so that you can leverage them towards your opening and readiness? And then surrounding us is this, what I call the ecosphere, is, you know, the rules on personal distancing, and how does that cut across all these areas? What is being set up by the CDC and federal guidelines that is going to impact our plan for readiness? What's the Maryland roadmap to recovery? And I talked about their 3 steps and how that's going to impact what we do. And finally, what are the university protocols that are going to come into play that we need to, again, manage and utilize in this? And finally, this is again talking about that the user, the administration lens, the user lens, and the risk management and policy. We can't look at one of these independent. They're mutually interdependent of each other, and we got to find that sweet spot. And I actually love how George phrased it, that we got to risk management, these policies have got to lead the way, but we also have to understand how does that work with the user, and how does that work with our administration of our programs and services, and find that sweet spot. And then finally, as we look at our resources and assets, we're going to have to, if you like Punnett squares, this is a great exercise to do with Punnett squares, but you can, if you just want to break it down into buckets, think of it, what is absolute and mission critical? And this is any type of resource or asset. Remember, your staffing, time, all these are resource and assets, right? So your hours of operation, that becomes a resource, right? What's absolute and mission critical? What is nice and you need if you have it, if it's possible, but it's not mission critical? What do you wish you could have or need? And then finally, we have to be realistic. What must we give up, right? And I'm stealing this word from Pam and from the board, but it's called purposeful abandonment. And please don't take the term negatively. It's not meant to be. It's just meaning that where are we intentional, knowing that we must give up something so that all the rest can make that desired or that achievable state that we need. And I'll close with that.
Thanks, Bill. We've had some great activity in the chat. We have a thread going right now around, is anyone thinking about what happens when a second wave hits, or if a second wave hits in your scenario planning? So it sounds like the California schools are doing that. Robb Bolton, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, and maybe you can say a little bit more about how you're approaching that scenario, what that scenario looks like.
Hi, Pam. Yeah, this is something that just came up in our president's briefing this week. And then since then, I've heard other schools talking about it. And this is a new plan. Just a week ago, this wasn't one of the scenarios. It was the main three that have already been discussed. But now people are talking about, what do they do now that more of the top medical professionals in the country are talking about this second wave that could hit in the fall. And what would that mean if we try to bring students to campus just at the normal time frame, and then we have to send them back again? So one of the plans is they're just looking at, well, what if we try to open up early, squeeze in a semester, and then let them leave earlier, thinking that that would miss that second wave. Obviously, that's a guessing game of when that second wave would be, and it still doesn't accommodate for the challenges of getting students to campuses early, bringing them in from all over the country. That still has a lot to be worked out, and testing and all that. So.
Yeah, and Whitney Slater from Washburn, do you want to add anything to that? Sounds like your state's considering the same.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same as what Rob just mentioned. Just kind of looking at some ideas of, not having a fall break and extending some class periods, but that's just became an early discussion late last week. So we're still kind of talking through some of those ideas as well.
Okay. So I want to open it up to the group a little bit around other questions you have for each other or for the panelists, areas you want to dive into a little deeper. Nope. Well, let's talk a little bit more about, and keep your questions going in the chat. Let's talk a little bit more maybe about how you create a shared sense of responsibility around safety and well-being, right? I've heard some chatter about how we have rules and policies around students who may ignore some of the new things you'll have to put in place around social distancing. We know that our staff, while some are eager to come back to work, others may be feeling anxious about coming back to work. And really this idea of reopening in a way that's safe and that promotes well-being for everyone. How do we create an atmosphere where that's a shared responsibility? It's shared between staff and patrons. It's shared between leadership and your staff. It's shared by that whole campus community around a sense of safety and well-being, and that we're prioritizing that. Is anyone thinking about that or have some particular strategies about that they'd like to share?
Pam, Greg Jordan here. I'll take a stab at some of it. Certainly, I mentioned in the chat that our president is one of those medical doctors, and like Bill has, and I think she's one of 4 university presidents on the governor's task force. The other 3 in Michigan are medical doctors too, at University of Michigan, Michigan State, and Wayne State. I know I saw Mike Wyden on the call. I'm not sure if Rick and Rob are on the call. But she talked about today in a meeting that I was on a call with her, she talked about how the conversation at the state level is really transcending into that at the university level. So the concerns that you're seeing about safety in the communities and in phases, reopening businesses and things like that was certainly into play. And so, at least in Michigan, job one has always been talking about safety. Safety of participants and safety of employees. So The Michigan governor in her executive order requires that all employers provide PPEs to employees when they return to the workplace. So we're working with our environmental health and safety and things like that to make sure that those are in place, not only for the professional staff, but for the public facing students when we are able to reopen. The other thing that they talk about a little bit is risk. And I think, George, you talked a little bit about risk and risk management. You know, categories you're seeing generally like a low, medium, and high risk. I don't think anybody thinks recreation centers and fitness centers are in the low risk capacity. You know, some might be medium, some might be high, depending on the state and maybe what the status is of the number of cases in your specific area. But that's coming into play, that we're going to be, you know, opening in phases as well, really working closely with campus partners on disinfecting and deep cleaning on a, you know, multiple time a day kind of scenario. Or we've even thought about, you know, letting people in for 45 minutes, letting them work out, kick everybody out, deep clean for 15, and let the next group in. You know, it's that kind of thinking that might take place. So I think there are campus committees, like I think both George and Mike talked about that certainly that's where these kind of conversations can take place to ensure, one, safety, and that appropriate precautions are taking place.
Are you in?
Who would like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things with he said. First of all, there's a template that Connect to, and not endorsing anybody, but that happened to be the one that we started looking at. That is a very nice spreadsheet with the various functional areas in it that can identify the risks. Because I know Greg talked about the risks, the various risks, and it really does. You rank the risks, and so you can begin to attack those things that are higher risks and so on. You know, and I think the second thing from an occupancy standpoint, we're right there, Greg, in that we're we're looking at the same kinds of schedule, modified schedule. We're open for a few hours, we're closed, and we do a cleaning. The question is, how deep a cleaning? And we're all waiting for those guidelines to tell us exactly what that is, especially at the USG level for us. What they would like us to follow. The other thing is there's some technology out there too that can help with occupancy numbers and that. So we can identify the risk. We can, sanitize and people feel a little safer because we're closing and then we're sanitizing and then we're opening and those kinds of things. But there's some technology out there, and we're working with some of our students. And so if I get some of the names wrong, I apologize. I'm not a very technical kind of person, but there's little devices called Raspberry Pis, and they're very cheap sensor kinds of things that can be hooked up at entrances to the various areas. And you can count people going in and count people coming out instead of having an employee right there. And it'll tell you how many people are in your area at any given time, and I think that will also help. We're also looking from a technology standpoint at some cameras, which would not ID or face anybody or anything like that, but would identify bodies in certain areas so that we can take a look at where the crowding is in various areas and maybe be able to work on fitness center layouts. Again, we all know we can separate machines, every other machine. We can do a number of those things, but also would give us the data that we need to tell us where that crowding may be that we're not seeing, because all of our buildings are very big. And those are some inexpensive approaches to the technology to kind of ensure the public that we're doing some things for them.
Mike, can I add on to that? I like the concept of leveraging technology and using it in different ways. And And one aspect you just hit there is that it brings reassurance back to our users. So that's a really important concept. When we were identifying hotspots, though, we realized that we could manage how we create personal distancing within the activity spaces. If it's changing equipment configurations, if it's our event services, changing room capacities and configurations, you can do the mathematics to do that. What we really found our hotspots to be, and what was harder to control, is our areas of people conveying, right? Whether it's common hallways, whether it's the pinch points at entries, or for us being a vertical building, elevators, right? Our elevator itself is less than 36 square foot of a footprint. You can't social distance in it. You can't personal distance in it. What does it mean for one person to go up and down an elevator to achieve an access point? It becomes, so these are the things that sometimes get overlooked. We can look, we can take out 3 pieces of fitness equipment for every 4 or something. But we forget about how people move around our facilities. And those are the areas we don't necessarily manage at a tactical level sometimes. So that's something that we have to put back into our thought process.
Pam, one of the things, I'm sorry I've kind of been in and out of the call, and this may have been covered before, but this kind of came up in a call earlier this week that David Gaskins led with a lot of really good thoughts and a lot of details. But I get a little bit concerned when we try to get outside what I call our headlights on some things. And I know some of us will have really good working relationships with our health center. If we are talking earnestly about temperature checks or maskings and things like that, I just challenge that can we be sustainable? Is this sort of within our ability? And I think in our zest to be back to some semblance of normal, I think we have to be really thoughtful about what we can do immediately and what we can sustain. And I get very concerned about things that get outside of our collegiate recreation sphere of influence and control. So I would challenge that. The other thing, and I'm probably coming off as a little bit of Debbie Downer on some of this, but the other thing I think that throttled this a little bit is that the backdrop of realistic finance has got to be in play here. So many of us are dealing with the idea that we're asked to try to perform as near to normal service with absolutely impossibly less budgets. And I think we're going to have a dose of reality here about the check's not blank. And we're going to have to model things around the idea that our funding sources, particularly our staffing sources, is going to be lessened. So this is going to speak and inform capacity to deliver and enforce a sustainable operation. I know a lot of us talk about reduced hours, but I'm talking about eyes on task. I'm talking about enforcing things that we know our patrons are going to be less than diligent about social distancing. So how much are we going to intervene to remind appropriately to that? That's a staffing issue. That's a cost issue. So just bringing up those things to be the dose of reality in the midst of our desire to get back to what we were.
Yeah, this is David Bowles. I'll continue with you there, George. I don't know how many of you got the email from Dave Elton with the what came out in the state of Alaska and what the governor said as far as opening back up fitness facilities. And if you read of everything that it said in that, it's a lot of it is exactly what we've talked about here. First of all, for those private facilities that staff at a lot lower level typically than we do, they're not going to be able to sustain they're not going to be able to meet any of those demands. Or they're not going to be able to meet enough of those demands to be able to stay open very long at all. And for us, in order to be able to do the things that we're talking about, to manage the 45 minutes on, 15 off, or anything such as that, in order to be able to manage from a policy perspective social distancing, which is going to be impossible in basketball. You're not going to be able to play basketball, and it's going to be extremely difficult in a weight room. But it's going to be so staff intensive, and the cleaning is going to be so staff intensive. And for us to say we're going to clean it and now it's safe to come in, if you clean your building in 15 minutes, are you comfortable telling someone with confidence that now there's no COVID-19 in there and they can come in safely? So I think there are some serious realities here about our ability to do this and to do it in a way that's safe for our student employees. So there you go, George. I continue with the Debbie Downer for you, which I don't normally like to do.
Well, and I'm going to call on Ken Morton, who popped up in the chat on this topic a little bit about what is that reasonable middle ground around what we expect the patrons to be responsible for versus what we're responsible for. So Ken, you want to add to this conversation?
Well, yeah, I think that's my question is, where is that? Because I agree with David. You can close down and clean every hour and then open back up for another hour. But as soon as somebody touches a machine, it's potentially contaminated. And so for the rest of that hour, it's now being used by other people. So I think we're going to lean, yes, we're going to do the cleaning. We're going to say, and when you read the guidelines, for it to actually be disinfectant, you have to leave the wet surface wet for 10 minutes or something. I mean, it's not like what we normally do. We normally clean with Terminator or whatever, but that doesn't disinfect it. It has to stay there for a number of minutes. So I'm just wondering if we don't put the onus on our patrons that assume everything is contaminated, don't touch your face, wash your hands all the time. We'll do a deep cleaning overnight every single time or whatever, and it'll be reasonable. But what kind of verbiage do we put as signage as you come in that makes sense, that still, but not giving people a false sense of security that our building is 100% disinfected. I don't think we could ever hit that perfection thing that George talked about. So there's got to be a middle ground somewhere between what we do and what we expect patrons to behave reasonably and take precautions themselves. And I'm just wondering where we fall on that, because I just don't see a scenario where we keep 100% of things disinfected to a point where it's a safe environment, technically. And so I just got to be in the middle somewhere.
Pam, if I can follow up on that. Hey, Ken, that is an excellent point, because one thing, we'll drive ourselves crazy trying to figure that out. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be a case by case based on each institution. And there's going to be things like in that model I showed, what's going to impact is going to be those external, what's happening in your ecosphere, right? But what we told our team today at our biweekly meeting is that control what we control the best that we can, right? And make sure we're messaging and educating the best that we can. And then make sure that we also have the resources so that the user can be successful in also being part of the active solution, right? So you've got to make sure you have the right materials for them. If you want them to wipe down equipment, you've got to have the materials for them to wipe down the equipment. If you want them to take some of the responsibility to maintain and help you disinfect, you got to make sure that you have the tools for them to be successful. But we got to be realistic. We can't overpromise. We can't overpromise and tell anyone that our facility is 100% safe. One, we're liable if we do, right? And I saw that motion, Dave, because Dave was like, wait a minute, Bill, what did you just say? But we have to be realistic on how we communicate personal responsibility, but we also know we have a duty of care that we have to maintain. And as George said, we still got to keep that risk management lens first and forward.
No, Bill, I'm completely agreeing with, in fact, very well said. I agree with everything you just said. But to go back to what George talked about earlier with their upper administration, with their vice presidents, this was a struggle I had when we were looking at when we would close. And we've got to be very clear. If our vice president says you have to make sure that everybody is 6 or 10 feet apart, well, we've got to be very clear that that's not possible, that I cannot accomplish that. And if you're going to sit in your office and think that's happening in my rec centers, then understand I am telling you that I cannot 100% of the time, or probably not even 75% of the time or less, I cannot guarantee that to you. And you need to make sure the president and the provost are aware of that as far as the decisions they're making, because they'll make a decision to want to keep the rec center open so they can continue to charge fees. But they've got to be clear, and we've got to be willing to tell them the realities of the situation, meaning I can't get it done. I can't guarantee you they're going to be 10 feet apart. Now you got to pass it up the line.
I agree with you, Dave, 100%. We held open, I don't think quite as long as you did, but we were open quite a long time. And that was the message that we had to keep pounding away at to our senior administration and even to our system offices, that we can't hold this any longer at the level that we need to be holding it. So, I think in any recovery or any reopening, it's a really solid, consistent communication and education plan to get that word to people that they have a responsibility on this. Obviously, as everybody has said, provide people with the tools and the sanitation that needs to be taking place. But again, it's going to be an education, and we all know the clientele that we work with is not good at that. We had difficulties before this in getting people to wipe down machines and providing them with the tools and showing them and communicating that. So, but I think it's a consistent communication and education plan going forward on what can be held both upward and downward.
A lot of times people say use decision-making, use data in decision-making. And so at Oakland, we experienced that where our staff did recommend that we close early, back it was March 9th, 10th, whatever that was. And our senior administration said, no, stay open. Campus is open, it's business as usual. And what we ended up finding was from the first day to like the fourth day that happened, we experienced a 77% drop in usage. And so in other words, Mike, I might disagree with you a little bit, at least. Maybe things were scary enough back then that people were staying away because they were scared to death of what was going on. And so we've used that moving forward of that 77% saying, no, we're not sure they are going to come back. And especially, I asked a question earlier, certainly seems like masks may be part of our future, in public and in indoor and outdoor spaces. Will our members, will our students, will our patrons come back and actually work out wearing masks? That can't be very comfortable. So I wonder what impact that's going to be, and maybe they're going to choose to at least to spend as much time outdoors. But use data. Again, we saw that huge drop off that when we were open, they weren't coming.
See, Greg, that's a great point, because the thing too is we know that there's always going to be challenges with patrons wanting to abide by what you are trying to educate as being a safe and conducive environment. But we also know that a lot of times those are the outliers, and we're going to be realistic. Our resources probably will be diminished in some respect. So how much do you invest on the outlier versus on the forward-looking, proactive responses to make sure that we're educating and we're modeling behavior so that the majority of our users are also modeling the same behavior. So it may not be that heavy lift in some areas, but again, we're still gonna have our outliers that you're gonna need to figure out what that enforcement looks like.
Hey, Pam, it's Laura Hall. Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Is there any plans or talk amongst NIRSA as an association putting together a task group specific to reopening? Not down to specific details, obviously, but just framework?
Yeah, there is. And where we're at on that is we've been gathering the different things that you all have seen shared on Connect, shared in these different roundtables today. There was one earlier this week that was fairly well attended by some East Coast schools. And then I'm in conversation with the NIRSA board about what does it look like to put together a quick task force, 3 to 5 people to kind of go through the guidelines, organize them in some way, and then produce them. I was telling the panelists at the beginning, so thank you for bringing this up. I wanted to get a sense from the group around whether those would be useful. And what I mean by that is this moving so fast that staying ahead of it is pretty impossible? Or no, it would be reasonable to, hit the pause button, gather up what's out there, look at it, and it would still have to be fast, over 3 or 4 days with a group of people, and even publish them or share them as a version, right? Here's the version as of May 10th, there may be version 2.0 as of June 1 as we learn more, expand things. And to your point, yeah, it wouldn't be down to the nth detail. It wouldn't be, you know, you should do it exactly like this. It's going to be categories of things to think about, questions to ask, considerations to make. And I think that following, some of you may have seen in the chat, the CDC is expected to produce guidelines for higher education, for institutes of higher education, as they call it. ACHA is working on guidelines to follow that. In the ACHA guidelines, there will be a recreation section, and I had a chance to review those. It is still fairly broad. You know, they will look to NIRSA and pointed to NIRSA in those guidelines for the specifics to recreation. I know that housing is working on a set of guidelines. I'm not sure about unions. I was trying to think of the major, you know, facility and operations in student life.
Awesome.
That was a long answer. The quick answer is yes. And if any of you are willing to serve on that task force, please pop into the chat and let me know.
So
I think
Pam,
in terms of the speed,
yeah.
sorry,
Yeah,
in terms of the speed, I think because all of us are operating on different timelines, while it might not help those institutions that are on the front end of reopening, it certainly would, I feel like, help the majority of us that might be a week or two behind those front runners.
Yeah. Yeah, because like I said on an earlier roundtable, it's been really interesting to watch how this is unfolded on a different timeline across the country. I mean, you all continue to be in very different places about this, and I suspect reopening will look, you know, the same in terms of it's going to look really different in different areas of the country.
Pam, quickly, housing at Kuhoi has put a task force together called Housing of the Future. What is it going to look like?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, in addition to guidelines, they're starting to think through, like, what does housing look like in the future, right? What is the long-term ramification of this?
Pam, Steve Ray.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that every state guidelines are different. Mm-hmm. So we have to consider what's coming out of our governor's office. And of course, the CDC hasn't come out with any specific guidelines for us to follow. Mm-hmm. So we're all on hold, especially in Kentucky. What's the next step that the governor's going to take and our university is going to take? And then what national guidelines are we going to take from organizations that may be from National Federation or NCAA? Mm-hmm. So we have to consider the differences across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think I want to just add, this is Tina Rice in Texas, is that as one of the, you know, first 10 states that have decided to like just jump the gun and move forward here. Yeah, I agree with you, Pam. Sometimes the information is just not, we're moving so fast that we can't catch up to it. But I think it seems to me like any like extra stuff is helpful, just as long, you know, even if it's in partial work, to start seeing some of that happen for those states and large cities that are moving so fast, it is really helpful.
Yeah, I thought it might be helpful, even with all the good stuff that's being shared, you know, even if we just had someone come in and organize it and put it all in one place and, you know, delete the duplications and, you know, just make that a little bit more, you know, do a little content curation on that, if you will. Okay, well, thanks for that feedback. That's really, really helpful. Because as you all are trying to stay one step ahead of your universities, of course, we're trying to stay one step ahead of you with the kinds of resources that you need.
And this is Lori and Braden. And, you know, I think one of these things, even though it's a moving target for, you know, we're all at a different place at a different time, and the disease is affecting us at different rates, and et cetera, et cetera. One of the biggest values, I think, as I suggested in my email to you this morning, not knowing what the topics were actually going to be for sure on this call, but this is all about when I sent you that email. I think that even though we will have the needle move, the value of NIRSA providing some guidance, I think would be very beneficial to a lot of small school operations, small staff operations, staff that have, you know, wear multiple hats. I think that gives them some talking points when they when they may or may not be in a position of power on their campus. And I think that's where NIRSA can benefit our membership the best. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously with the caveats of follow your local health organization, follow the CDC, follow the WHO. Here is some best practices, you know, across higher education. But I think that as a resource for our members, a task force such as this can be beneficial for our small and medium-sized schools and small staffs who just don't have, I noticed in the chat, somebody said they don't have access really to their legal services department on their campus. And is, as a director in a small school, and I've been in that scenario, to be able to share with my institutional leadership, hey, this is what these professional associations are doing, and here is their source for recommendations. Here's the plan we'd like to follow, puts people in a position of strength as they have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I'll make a plug for some of our small to medium-sized schools who, for a long time have had to get super creative, wear multiple hats, really operate in a different environment. And I think as the larger schools who have been able to rely on larger resources for the most part, really have a lot that they could learn or borrow from the small and medium-sized schools. And Lori, I know you've worked at a range of institutions of all sizes, so you probably see that too. I think there's a lot to learn from small programs right now.
Oh, we're going to learn a lot. And I feel like that's been a strength that I feel I've benefited from working at, schools in all, basically small, medium, and large. And that is, when you get in a large scenario, and I'm in that now, and well-resourced, it gives you the resilience to say, okay, well, no, we can do it this way because I know we've done it that way in the past or in a different iteration. So I feel very blessed to have that tool in my toolbox. Although sometimes when we have to lead our folks who don't have that tool, and you have to say, look, here's the hammer and you need the hammer, or here's the screwdriver, you don't get to use the hammer. We'll all learn. And I look at this as a great, as a good opportunity and challenge for all of us across higher education and the sphere of health and well-being. Kathleen Hatch and I were talking about a week and a half ago on the phone, and one of the things that I think that we can all capitalize on, and Kathleen said this, and I agree 100% with her, is that how awesome is it that truly, besides the neuroscience of physical activity learning, besides now really people are starting to value in a different way, at a different level, what we do, how we serve, and what we can offer in terms of people's health. So that's an area that we get to capitalize on through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, well said, Lori. You're right. Like, this is now an essential moment for us, not an ancillary moment. And, nothing goes in front of health, but we are now seen as an essential part to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kathleen and Lori, which is a great end to our discussion today around, even as we move through a lot of change and a lot of considerations, and I think as leaders, you're probably in some details about your operations that you haven't been in a long time because it's all changed and new, and you're supporting staff in different ways. But I think, coming together as leaders in NIRSA, this is a moment for all of us to pick our head up, to remember our why, remember our core purpose, remember that this is about health and well-being, remember that this is about inclusion, and Kathleen and some others brought up kindness. This is about how we're delivering not just student engagement, but a sense of belonging, right? And historically, we've had this platform of recreation, and we've done that a certain way, and we've been successful in all that. And it's really about taking the power of all of your considerable skills and experiences, and now continuing to deliver health and well-being, social connectedness, a sense of belonging, engagement in your campus communities in this new reality. And I'm confident. I love joining these directors' calls. I'm confident that we'll do it. We'll do it together. Bill or George had to drop off a few minutes early. Bill or Mike, do you want to make any final comments?
I think the discussion's been great, and I think Kathleen summed up the end of it really excellent. I think we have a chance to lead in this space moving forward, and our services are valued, and we need to make sure that that's communicated, and we lead with health, we lead with well-being, and we affirm our core values and keep moving forward.
well said. I can't add anything. I think there are a number of opportunities that we can certainly take advantage of now, and I think that's the way we have to look at it and continue looking forward and take advantage of all of them.
And I am going to say, I've said this before too, when we do return and we land back on our campuses, find times to celebrate, right? You're probably going to celebrate when you first return with your staff, and then when your patrons come back, celebrate again, because we want to make sure that as we return to what we can achieve, and we know it's going to be different, we just don't want to neglect or forget that the appreciation and the gratitude we need to share to everyone.
All right, well, we took a week off from this Directors Roundtable last week as we had Career Development Week, and we are adding these back on a weekly basis as long as you find them useful. So hopefully I will see you again next week for another one of these roundtables. I suspect we'll still be focused somewhat on reopening, but if you have other ideas about areas of focus or even something within reopening that you'd like to focus on, please just email me and we can make that happen. So happy Wednesday. Bye everyone.